So recently, one of my lovely viewers donated this to the channel. It's a Radxa Rock 4 SE single board computer, and it's essentially a competitor to the Raspberry Pi 4. So I wanted to put it through its paces. Let's see how it gets on right here on Jeff's Pie in the Sky. Hello once again, Pi geeks and techno nerds all over the world. My name's Jeff, and I'm an IT professional who's been in the industry for over 30 years. I've been using Raspberry Pi since they first came out, and I wanted to share with you some of the things that I've done with them over the years. If you like what you see on this channel, please hit that thumbs up button, subscribe if you want to see more, and hit that notification bell so you can be told when I put a new video out. Let me know in the comments what you think about this video, and if you've got any ideas for projects that you'd like to see me do in the future, put those in there as well. All of the comments and the interaction really helps the channel. I'm trying to get to 5,000 subscribers before the end of the year, so anything you can do to help me out there would be really greatly appreciated. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, one of my lovely viewers called Nelly sent me one of these, a Radxa Rock 4 SE single board computer. Now, given the specs of this thing, it's really pitched as being a competitor to the Raspberry Pi 4 as opposed to the Raspberry Pi 5. So don't expect top-end performance out of this. But what I really want to do through this video is compare how it performs to the Pi 4. Now, when you receive one of these, it will be in the little cardboard box that you can see in this picture. When you open that up, you'll find the single board computer is actually wrapped up in a little static bag. Now, this is a little bit more precarious than some Radxa products where they put them in a little plastic box, but it's still packaged really well. Taking the board out of the static bag, this is the view from the top. The really interesting thing here is you can't actually see the SoC, or the main processor. That's actually hidden underneath. And you can see that here along with the memory. Now, one of the really big selling points of the Rock 4 SE is the fact that it's got this NVMe port built onto it. The Raspberry Pi 4 does not have one of these. And what this means is that you can connect an NVMe drive directly to the single board computer. And this provides a native ability to have not only bigger storage, but much faster storage directly on the SBC. In terms of connectivity, if we look at the first edge here, on the left-hand side, you've got the USB-C power port, and the little 2-pin connector that you can see on the underside is to connect a battery for a real-time clock. Next to that, there's one full-size HDMI port, and so this is less than the Pi 4 where it has 2 micro HDMI ports. The connector that you can see just here is a MIPI port that you can use to connect an LED display. And then there's the audio connector. Flipping around by 90 degrees, you can see a gigabit Ethernet interface, 2 USB 3.0 ports, and 2 USB 2.0 ports. Just on the bottom down here, you can see a little switch. When that's switched to the left as you're looking at it here, this top USB 3 port becomes an OTG port. And what that means is you could have the device behave as a USB device as opposed to a USB host. And again, the Raspberry Pi doesn't feature this. Flipping around 90 degrees once more, you have the GPIO pin headers, but there's not a lot more to say here. These are just laid out exactly the same as the Raspberry Pi. On the final edge here, this big port on the top is a CSI camera port, and you can just see the SD slot just on the bottom there. The NVMe slot is just behind it. Now, one thing that does drive me a little bit nuts with this board is that when you plug in a micro SD card, it does protrude from the single board computer quite a way. It makes it quite precarious. It would be quite easy to catch that on something and ultimately tear the whole SD connector straight off the board. As you can see here, it's even worse with an NVMe drive. When you have that connected, there's nothing to support it. And so it's just kind of sticking out. And again, you could catch that on something, accidentally rip it out, or break the port if you're not careful. If we flip back to the underside view of the board, it does make sense why they had the NVMe port pointing out to the left as opposed to across the board out to the right. The actual main processor is here right in the middle. And of course that will get quite hot. And so if you put a heatsink on there, then there's no way you could fit an NVMe drive on if it pointed this way. Even without a heatsink, the heat that would come up off of the SoC would probably damage your NVMe drive. So it is actually better for it to come out from the left-hand side. And I know there are adapters available that would allow you to effectively use a ribbon cable to flip that back round on itself so you could mount it on the bottom with a suitable little gap there above the processor. But let's take a look at the specs of this board and see how it compares to a Raspberry Pi 4 Model B. Well, in terms of the CPU, the Pi 4 has a quad-core ARM Cortex-A72 running at 1.8 GHz, whereas the Rock 4 SE has a dual-core A72 only running at 1.5 GHz, but then it also has 4 cores of Cortex-A53 running at 1 GHz. So the CPU benchmarks will be really interesting for this. I would expect the Raspberry Pi 4 to win out in the single core metrics because it only has Cortex-A72 cores and they're running at a higher clock frequency compared to those on the Rock 4 SE. However, in the multi-core scores, it should be a closer contest because even though the Rock 4 SE only has 2 of those fast A72 cores, the fact that it has more cores overall should actually make it fairly comparable. In terms of memory, the Raspberry Pi 4 comes in options of 1, 2, 4 or 8 GB LPDDR4 3200 memory. The Rock 4 SE only comes in a 4 GB flavour, but it's the same speed memory. For a GPU, the Raspberry Pi 4 has a Broadcom Video Core 6, and the Rock 4 SE has an ARM Mali T860 MP4 GPU. In theory, this should just beat the Video Core 6, but we'll see how that plays out in the GPU benchmarks. Both SBCs support Wi-Fi 5 and Bluetooth 5, and for USB, both have 2 USB 3 ports and 2 USB 2 ports, although, as I mentioned earlier, the Rock 4 SE does allow one of those USB 3.0 ports to become an OTG port. For the display, the Pi 4 has 2 micro HDMI ports that can output up to 4K 60 frames a second. The Rock 4 SE has 1 full-size HDMI port, again 4K 60 frames a second. Now, a lot of people really don't like the micro HDMI ports because they are somewhat fragile, whereas the full-size HDMI ports are really solid. So there's just 2 really different philosophies there. The Raspberry Pi allows you to have 2 displays, but the connector is inferior. The Rock 4 SE only allows you to have 1 display, but it is with a better connector. Now, on top of the HDMI sockets, both SBCs feature a MIPI DSI port for connecting another LED display, and both of these can be driven up to 1080p 60 frames a second. And also both feature a MIPI CSI camera port. Both also have a 4-pole audio jack, but one other place where the SBCs do diverge is in their hardware video decode support. Both support H.264 up to 1080p 60 frames a second, and H.265 4K at 60 frames a second, but the Rock 4 SE also supports VP9 decode at 4K 60 frames a second. Now, VP9 is a codec developed by Google and is what is used for YouTube. So in theory, we should get better YouTube playback performance on the Rock 4 SE. And again, I'll test that later. For hardware video encode, the Raspberry Pi supports H.264 1080p up to 30 frames a second. Now, on the Rock 4 SE, it doesn't actually list any support for hardware video encode at all. I'm going to assume it can't do it, purely because it's not mentioned in the specs anywhere. That said, I suspect there may be something hidden away in that ARM Mali GPU that could be used for hardware video encoding, but I don't know that for certain. And so I'm going to assume right now it doesn't exist. Both feature a 40-pin GPIO set. However, as per a lot of the Radxa and Orange Pi boards, there are more specialist pins within the GPIO collection that can be used for specialist use cases. For instance, there's another pair of pins that could be used for UART. You get more SPI support, more I2C support, and better pulse width modulation support. For graphics, the Raspberry Pi supports up to OpenGL ES 3.1, and the Rock 4 SE supports up to ES 3.2. Both support Vulkan 1.0, but the Rock 4 SE also supports OpenCL 1.2 and DirectX 11.1. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of all of the benchmarking, I just wanted to mention operating systems for a second. On the Raspberry Pi, there's obviously Raspberry Pi OS that you can write to a micro SD card straight from Raspberry Pi Imager. For the Rock 4 SE, things are a little bit limited in that there are options available for Android 11, Debian 11, or Ubuntu 20. Now, these are all quite old versions of these operating systems, and it's something that I found to be a recurring theme with Radxa. When they release a board, they normally do a pretty good job in releasing some well-developed ports of common operating systems onto their products. However, they don't continually maintain them. So in this case, Ubuntu 20 is really old, with Ubuntu 24 available now. And Debian 11 has been replaced by Debian 12, with Debian 13 not very far away. Now here, I was able to find someone who's produced a Debian bookworm operating system for the Rock 4 SE. And I've actually found this works reasonably well. And I also found for the CPU and GPU benchmarks that it actually gave better results. So I think the bookworm operating system does have some optimizations there that weren't there in the Bullseye release. So I just want to make it clear that I will be using this bookworm release for running the CPU benchmarks. However, I also want to point out a couple of things that I couldn't get to work at all. Now, if I put my NVMe drive into a USB 3 caddy and I plug that into a Raspberry Pi 4, it works perfectly well. However, when I plug that into the 4SE, regardless of whether it's running the Bullseye or the bookworm version of Debian, it's not actually able to connect to the NVMe drive. Well, actually that's not strictly true. It does connect, but it can't derive the capacity of the disk, and therefore it doesn't expose it to the operating system. So when it comes to deriving USB 3 performance later on, whereas I'd normally use my USB 3 NVMe caddy to test that read performance, I'll be using a SanDisk Extreme Pro SSD instead. This is a more conventional thumb drive style SSD, but it's still high performance, so it should give us some really good figures. But anyway, all of that aside, let's go and get started by taking a look at some of the CPU benchmarks. Now here, I'm on my Rock 4 SE, and I've downloaded the Geekbench 6 benchmark software. Now, in order to get this, you've got to go to the preview section of the Geekbench website, but then you can download the ARM64 version of the software right there. And this will work just fine, both on the Radxa Rock 4 SE and on the Raspberry Pi 4. And I'll put links in the description for all of the software that you see in this video today. So now I have everything downloaded and I've extracted the tarball. All I need to do is move into the directory that contains the software and run the Geekbench AArch64 executable. And again, I just want to emphasize here, I am running on that experimental bookworm release of the operating system here. And that will just go off and start running the benchmarks. Rather than putting a load of duplication into the video, when I run these on the Raspberry Pi, I'll do that off screen and then I'll just present the results at the end. Now this is finished, if you don't have a Geekbench account, like I don't, then Geekbench won't show you the results right here in the console. Instead, it posts up the results to their website. So you just grab this URL here and paste it into your browser, and then you can see the result. So here you can see I've got a single core score of 253 and a multi-core score of 666. So now let's see how that compares with the Raspberry Pi 4. And here are the Raspberry Pi results, and they are quite interesting. As I mentioned earlier, it doesn't surprise me that the single core score is actually higher than that from the Rock 4 SE. And this is because those A72 cores do run at a higher clock frequency on the Raspberry Pi. However, given that scale of difference, I am surprised it's only getting a few points higher. Now on the multi-core score, it's actually scored worse than the Rock 4 SE by 30 points. And again, I think this really comes down to the fact that even though the Rock 4 SE only has 2 A72 cores and then 4 A53 cores, it still has more cores overall. And so when you consider these benchmarks, the two SBCs actually come out really pretty equal. The next thing I want to test is how performant the memory is on these two SBCs. And I wrote a little bit of software to test this. It's available on my GitHub page here. All it does is create 100 megabytes of random data in memory and then copies that to a new memory location. It then times how long it takes to make that copy and display the result. So in order to grab this, I can just come down to the code button here and use this copy button next to the URL that it shows. I then just have to run git clone and then paste in that URL. Once all the code is cloned, I can just move into the memory test directory, compile it using gcc memcpy.c -o memcpy, and then just run it with /memcpy. And here on the Rock 4 SE, that's taken 0.091 seconds. If we now look at the Raspberry Pi 4, it's a really surprising result. It's actually taken significantly longer to do that memory copy, 0.124 seconds. Now both of these SBCs claim to have 4 GB of LPDDR4 3200 memory, so I'd actually expect this to come out identically. So I really don't have any explanation at all as to why the Rock 4 SE seems to have had such a win here. The next thing I want to test is the GPU performance. And this is another thing where the operating system on the Rock 4 SE has become quite critical. If I run this test using the stock Bullseye operating system, I get some strange results where everything seems to be locked at 60 frames a second. This makes me think that the GPU has been set to use VSync, where its maximum output frame rate will be matched to the monitor that it's connected to. However, for GPU benchmarking, this is really bad, as it constrains the benchmark to only be able to output at 60 frames a second. Running here on the experimental Debian Bookworm OS, this constraint doesn't seem to be there, so I'm going to be running this benchmark on this operating system. Now, GL Mark II is my GPU benchmark of choice, and the way I like to run it is not to run it within a GUI like this. Instead, I like to hit the Ctrl-Alt-F2 keys to break out into a separate VT terminal, and then run the GL Mark II software as GL Mark II-ES2-DRM from here. This will then run all of the benchmarks in a native full screen, rather than being windowed within the operating system, and I just find this gives a more reliable result. So if I just kick this off here, you'll see it just starts with the benchmarking. It will go through a whole bunch of different scenarios, and then at the end it will give us a result. And here are the results. I've just pasted these into a terminal window because they'll be easier to read. Now here on the Rock 4 SE, it scored a GL Mark II score of 325. If we flip over to the Raspberry Pi, it's only scored 230. So that ARM Mali GPU that's in the Rock 4 SE is actually really capable. I'm super impressed with these figures, and some of these frame rates really are astonishing for a little single board computer. Now on the subject of graphics, one other thing that I wanted to run here was YouTube playback. Now here I'm actually playing a 4K video, as you can see on the Stats for Nerds page. Now of course this is scaling down into a small window there, but in the HTOP display to the right, you can see that although the CPU is being driven by the Chromium process, the actual video decode isn't actually using up much CPU at all. And this is thanks to that VP9 codec hardware decode that's built in. It's making this 4K playback work really well. Now you may think it's only because this is running within a scaled window that it looks so good. But if I make this full screen, you can still see that it's playing really well. Stats for Nerds is showing that roughly speaking about 10% of frames are dropped. And that's not great, but you can see it's still extremely watchable. And even with that playing full screen, if I bring up HTOP here, you can see that the CPU is still not being driven very hard. Now on the Raspberry Pi here, the biggest problem is that even though this is a 4K video, we can't even select 4K as a playback option. We can only select 1080p. Now this does play out just fine on a Raspberry Pi 4 here, but you can see if 4K playback is an important thing to you, the Rock 4 SE is actually miles better, since it's got that extra VP9 hardware decoder. The next thing I want to test here is the SD card read performance on each of the SBCs. The first thing I run here is lsblk, and from there I can get the ID of my SD device. I can then run the hdparm tool, specifying -t, --direct, and then the name of my SD card device. And that gives me read performance here of 56.94 megabytes a second. Now again, I do want to point out here, this is running the Bullseye operating system. If I did the same thing in the Bookworm operating system, it seems to be capped out at about 20 megabytes a second. So it seems like in that experimental version of the Bookworm OS, there's something a little bit wrong with the SD drivers. Switching over to the Raspberry Pi, my ID is a little bit different, but I should be able to do the same thing. And here it's achieved a read rate of 41.50 megabytes a second. So again, this has been a surprising win for the Rock 4 SE. I've now taken a SanDisk Extreme Pro 128GB SSD and I've plugged it into the USB 3 port of the 4 SE. So it's now showing up as a device SDA. So I should now be able to use the hdparm tool against that to see what its read performance is like. And it should give me some indication as to how well it can read from the USB 3 port. In this case, it's achieved 142 megabytes a second. Now this actually isn't great. This equates to around 1.1 gigabits per second. And a USB 3 port should be able to cope with 5 gigabits per second. So it's a long way off the theoretical maximum. But on these little SBCs, there's quite a lot that can get in the way of that performance, so it's not entirely surprising. I've now removed that from the 4 SE and plugged it into the Raspberry Pi. So let's see how well it does. And it's recorded 193 megabytes a second, so way better. Although that is still only about 1.5 gigabits per second. So again, well short of the 5 gigabits a second that a USB 3 port should be able to achieve. Back on the Rock 4 SE, and I've now attached an NVMe drive to the NVMe socket that's on the bottom of the board. And let's see how well that performs. And here you can see that's been able to achieve 313 megabytes a second. Now this is 2.5 gigabits a second, so it's a really good data rate. Now NVMe is effectively just a remapping of a PCI Express socket. Now I haven't found in the documentation just what standard the NVMe socket on the Radxa Rock 4 SE is meant to adhere to. However, one lane of PCI Express Gen 2 supports a theoretical maximum speed of 500 megabytes a second, so we're certainly inside that ballpark. And that makes this NVMe socket quite an interesting prospect. You can get NVMe to PCI Express slot adapters. Indeed, I'm using one on my NAS currently. So in theory, you could make use of something like that and start attaching PCI Express cards straight into the Radxa Rock 4 SE. And you certainly can't do that on a Raspberry Pi 4. So if we take a look at a summary of all of the results we've got, what we can find is actually the Radxa Rock 4 SE is a really solid single board computer. And with the exception of USB 3 performance, it beats a Raspberry Pi 4 in almost every single category. And the inclusion of that NVMe socket is really exciting, because that brings in the potential for you to be able to start playing with PCI Express devices via that NVMe port. Now that said, I do want to stress I have had a lot of hassle with the operating systems on the Radxa. Some things, like the NVMe drive, I could only get to work within the stock Debian Bullseye operating system that's provided by Radxa. However, things like the GL Mark II software to get the GPU benchmarks didn't work well in Bullseye at all because it seemed to be constrained by something like VSync, whereas the experimental Bookworm operating system worked much better for that. But in that experimental Debian Bookworm OS, I couldn't get the NVMe socket to work at all. And so software support for the Radxa Rock 4 SE, along with all of the Radxa products, just seems to be lacking. The documentation is great, the actual board itself is fantastic, but Radxa's commitment to providing ongoing support for the software that they provide just really isn't there, Whereas on the Raspberry Pi, they continually provide really good updates for all of their product line. So it really is horses for courses. If you are more of a tinkerer and really want to experiment with the potential of these boards, then the Radxa Rock 4 SE is a really compelling option. And that's especially true when you look at the price at the bottom here. Now, I fully understand in this world of global tariffs and various other strifes, prices and availability of these products can vary wildly depending on where you live. So I've listed here the price purely based on my location here in the UK and as at the time of recording, which is the 5th of June 2025. And right now I could go to Pimeroni and I could pick up a Raspberry Pi 4 Model B for £52.50. Or I could go to Amazon and I could pick up a Radxa Rock 4 SE for $59.99. So the prices aren't actually wildly different from each other. And when you look at the performance of the Rock 4 SE, you actually seem to be getting an awful lot for that extra £7. So thanks so much to Nelly for sending in that Radxa Rock 4 SE for me to take a look at. It's a great piece of hardware and I'm extremely grateful to you for sending it in. But that's it for this video. Once again, if you like what you see here, please hit that thumbs up button. Subscribe if you want to see more and hit that notification bell so you can be told when I put a new video out. Let me know in the comments how you get on with your single board computers. And if you've got any ideas for projects that you'd like to see me do in the future, including looking at other SBCs, put those in the comments as well. And again, all of that interaction helps enormously with the growth of the channel. And with your help, I'm sure I can get to that 5,000 subscriber target by the end of the year. Thanks so much for watching till the end. And until next time, bye for now.